Cool. So today, I think this topic isn't really covered enough too. Like we see so much content on people talking about buying companies, right? Talking about buying deals, and there's very little content and data and things that actually people go deep on as to how do you actually grow a company once you either own it yourself, maybe you've built it yourself, and you're kind of stalling at a certain point, or you make an acquisition, you look to actually grow your platform itself too. And there's so much content on how do you go buy a business. There's very little content on how do you go run a company with a focus on actually growing it. But a lot of people are very happy they can go acquire a company and it just maintains. But today I want to actually really cover a lot on growth. I know in our end, we've been working the last 6 months really heavily internally, as putting the systems in place, right, to allow ourselves to have the capacity, the team, the operations, the systems to allow ourselves to go scale as we look to go bigger too. And hopefully there's some lessons here for people doing the same thing as well that you can go take from it. So, Chris, why don't you kick it off on just some of like the super high level things like how you think about growth in a company, what has to happen, what change has to be made, who has to be hired, all those things.
Yeah. So honestly, the first place where I start at with growth is when you start growing a company, fundamentally what you're doing is introducing risk into the business, right? And growth, and everybody should look at growth as growth equals risk. And really, so the first step when I'm looking at growing a company is going to the basics and saying, what are my risks of growth? How much money am I going to have to spend in order to grow? And how is that going to affect and change the business? There's some areas of growth that people don't often think of. But for example, when you have a team of people who are used to doing something a certain way, and what got you from, let's say, $1 million of revenue to $10 million of revenue isn't going to be the same thing that's going to get you from 10 million to 20. It's kind of use different tools to get to different kind of revenue markers. And so you have a group of people who are used to doing something a certain way and coming to work and being comfortable and liking their job and all that stuff. And then what you're going to go and do when you're growing the company is you're going to disrupt their process. You're going to disrupt how they feel about the company. And so, when I look at growing a company, the first thing, I look at is, how can we make sure that our employees are aware of the growth, that they know about the growth, that we're going through and we're telling them about what we're doing, we're getting their buy-in. Because a lot of times when you start growing, people just have to step up and do more in the beginning. And unless they're getting compensated for doing that, unless that they're a part of the bigger picture, you'll start to lose employees as you're trying to grow. And I see a lot of mistake that people make when they're trying to grow a company is they say, look, we're going to grow and we're going to push, but then they don't anticipate that could maybe cause 10 to 15% of their employees to leave. And so, when you're looking at growing the company, I always look at it from like a risk-based perspective of here's the risks of growing. Who could we lose? Who can we afford to lose? Who do we know today isn't going to be with us, kind of in the long term here? And it's really identifying what those risks are. So when you're building your growth strategy, you can make sure that you grow in a way that isn't going to grow you off a cliff.
It's also important too, is that there's the other side of it as well, is that when you start actually growing, what happens is that you open up way, way, way more opportunity for people internally. So the ones who are really bought in and can actually help facilitate the growth happening, the changes in the company, that opens up tons of new, whether it be leadership roles, step up type roles too, right? The rising tide then kind of opens up more opportunities for those folks too. So I think it's a really important thing. I know you, Jeff, and I were talking this the other day in person, is like mapping out a career path for folks that, hey, if you guys go deliver, right, these are things that can go open up for you and will help you get to that position by you hitting certain metrics, right? Where you can kind of go map out a career hierarchy for a person who has been a great team member for the last while that's saying, hey, if you help us go execute these things, you stay within these metrics, right? You delivered on these deliverables. These are the paths you can go take. This is what it'll take to go do that. This is what it will, potentially be in compensation for you going forward, and making that path really clear to them as to, if you do this, you have the opportunity for that. And then we'll invest into you as well too, as an employee of the company, for helping us get to these places too. So I think it's important to look at it from both sides, as yes, there is change and some people won't be on board with it, but the ones who are, it creates way more opportunity than they would have had previously.
100%. And, specifically Nationwide and in the Pave, we're in growth mode right now. We're putting in the investments in order to grow. And, one of those things is getting the employees bought in. And so when Sam, when you were here, you saw the parking lot of all the trucks of all the guys who came in. Sam had to park in the middle of the parking lot because there weren't any more parking spaces. But really what that was is our operations team did a presentation and saying, hey, here's where we're going. We're looking to, at the Nationwide division, double our revenue in the month of June. And so it was really important that everybody in the company understood what we're pushing for, why we're, busier than normal. And we brought them all in. We ordered Chick-fil-A, and we had a great team meeting where they could see and get bought in. And the result of that was now all of these guys, just to Sam's point, they see, oh, wait a minute, there's going to be an opportunity for me to go from being like, a rake man to maybe being able to get trained up as an operator of equipment. And the operators of equipment are kind of looking and say, hey, I might have the ability to jump over and be a foreman. And the foreman's like, oh, I could be a superintendent because we're, building. And so people start to peg in their minds of like, how do I get there? And then what our operations team has done a great job at with our HR department is helping them map out where they would want to be. And then when we're looking at, oh, hey, when we add another crew, we're going to need another operator, we're going to need another superintendent or we're a foreman or whatever it may be, we can start looking at our internal pool of candidates and say, hey, Billy, Bob, and Joe all wanted to be foreman and wanted that, who's been displaying leadership, and we can promote them into that role. So they, so we don't have to go and bring somebody else in. We really like hiring internally and training people up. Sometimes it is necessary to bring other folks in, but for the most part, we want to give our team the opportunities to step up and be a part of the growth.
It also makes a really attractive place to go work too, right? If you look at any business in general, but especially the field that we're in, labor is so crucial to being able to go succeed, right? In terms of having great people on your team. And if you're getting reached out to by a variety of companies looking to go hire, and you see that, hey, this is where I am today, we've had 10 people go into this role and move to the next role on, or whatever it may be too, it helps when looking at the recruiting, the hiring process, and retaining really good people who are bought into the company vision. I think the operation meeting was super helpful for folks too to go see, yes, these are changes that are being made. This is why, and this is in turn what will actually open up for you too. I think at times a lot of companies miss the latter part where they make all these changes, they go push for certain things, and people have no clue what's actually going on at the top of the company in terms of the intention behind it. So it's a lot easier to go row in the right direction when they know the direction you're actually going in versus just being in the dark about certain things. So I think people are seeing now internally that it creates opportunity, that the direction is really positive type thing, right? So people are kind of seeing different paths that they can go here internally as well. And so
it makes all the difference.
Yeah. And so on the system side too, kind of walk us through, right, what changes have to be made to go from, right, stable, very, very profitable company to now getting ready to go take the next big leap when looking at scaling up bigger, right? Like what system changes, I'd say not necessarily more corporate, but more process, more systems, more SOPs. Like walk us through some of those changes that have been made to go lay the right groundwork so that things won't break or will break far less as we look to go scale.
So when we break down, okay, how are we going to grow this company and what are we going to do to drive the growth? We really look at, we really start with the process. If you have a bad process or a process that isn't working, and let's say you're doing $2 million a month, when you jump to $5 million a month and that process wasn't working at 2 million, it's really going to not work at 5 million. And it's going to become a lot harder to change because then now you're kind of in the chaos of growth. And then you have this process that's failing. So the first thing that we do is we go in and we identify all the different processes. And I'll give you an example. We had our quality assurance process for ensuring that there was high quality on the jobs was pretty much the operations manager and the VP of operations and the project managers just verbally communicating and FaceTiming the guys on the job to make sure everything was good. Well, that works when you're doing, 5 jobs a day or 4 jobs a day. But when you start doing 25 jobs a day or 20 jobs a day, all of a sudden you can't go and FaceTime every single crew doing every single thing. And we work 24/7. So we're working in the middle of the night. So how do you have the guy who's out there in the middle of the night finishing a Wells Fargo parking lot before 9 a.m.? So, how do you handle those things? And so what we realized is we need to figure out what systems we can put in place, what process we can put in place to really make sure we can maintain quality on these jobs, but then also not be so reliant on this manual kind of handoff of communication. So what we did is we sat down and we said, here's the new process that we want to use. Here's the technology that we're going to implement in order to do it. And then we practiced that process before we really started growing because we wanted to make sure that process was good. So when we look at the last 6 months, really the first 3 months, we're identifying the different processes that need to change, what we feel really good about, what we don't feel good about, and having that honest conversation. The next 3 months, we're optimizing the processes and putting the new processes in place. And then now the next 3 months, we're starting month 1 in June. Now the next 3 months are grow as hard as we can, circle back and see what broke, see what didn't work. And we'll never get it right 100% of the time. It's never happened. So there's always stuff that breaks. But if we can reduce, again, when we look at it from a risk analysis or a risk, kind of perspective, it's like, how do we reduce our probability of failure as much as possible through, good planning and good preparation.
And you mentioned something too that's really important, right? If you go think about brands like a Wells Fargo that have hundreds, if not thousands, of locations in general, a big thing that they want when looking at work, whether them or companies like them, is consistency across the jobs. So when you look at getting a repeat business, oftentimes in this space, what you'll see is we'll win a small subset or a given area of a company's locations. And what they do from there is they really dig into, is this work good? Is this work quality? Will I go put my name as the person who is hiring these vendors on them as a quality rep to go bring to other areas as well too. So for us, quality control is so crucial, as our customers are usually our best growth levers as well, right? Of like, it's really simple. If you do good work for people, if you show up on time, you complete things on budget, you do things the right way, and that you have to go back and fix them. And if you do mess up for whatever reason, go back and fix it. That goes such a long way to, one, keeping them as clients long term, but two, getting access to the likely hundreds, if not thousands of other locations that they may have. And their friends from similar positions as well too, is that word travels fast in terms of quality of work.
I never we really focus on this is we're going to do our best to never have to go back on a job because it's expensive for us to have to go back. It's a profitability, question. But once we are going back, everything's designed on how do we preserve the relationship with the customer and how do we make sure we know that customer knows that we're not just here when the job goes well, we're also here when the job goes bad. And, when we do have a job that, the customer's frustrated on or whatever, we on our team internally start assigning people to that customer to make sure they're proactively reaching out and making sure that we've solved their problem, that they've had a good customer experience. Because in our industry, what most people do is they just ghost you, right? They send the guys out, they ghost you, and then you can never get them back on the phone. And, you pretty much have to sue them to come back and fix the work. And so what we're trying to do here across our companies is create a standard and a level where, we're very customer centric, customer focused organization. And we want our customers to have the best experience that they possibly can. And, that includes that when we do make mistakes that we go back, we fix them and we make them right.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a big, like whatever business you're into, just, your word goes a long way in terms of delivering both quality and on time. And that goes such a long way too, especially when things aren't going how you may plan for whatever reason, right? But now you kind of think, let's think through more of the systems that were put in place, right? I think a really unique thing too, that I was talking to Mike about too, is the maintenance plan. right? Of people at times in this space are so reactive, right? You own a store, the store has a hole in the parking lot. You then react to go get it fixed immediately. Where most people aren't thinking ahead in this business. I know both of us have a lot of friends in the multifamily space, right? Every May or June, the insurance company comes out, their lender comes out, and they're like, hey, so and so, go fix all this stuff. And you have to go scramble to go find people in the busiest season for their business, right? To go fix all your stuff. In turn, you pay a premium, you get lack of quality work. And it's just to go get a reprieve from your lender, make sure insurance will renew you. But I think on our end, we've thought about this a lot differently in terms of how can we proactively go help folks like this, where on our end, we're actually reaching out to them directly versus it being a reactive thing for them. So this is something they know they have to go do. They can't get renewed by their insurance. They can be in issues with their lenders, right? And they're just scrambling. So Chris, why don't you kind of walk through an RN to like what we've done on the maintenance program to just make this a better overall experience for that owner?
Yeah. So one of the biggest things about asphalt and when people are looking is the cost is relatively unknown as to when your asphalt will deteriorate. So what a maintenance plan and what a maintenance programs does is it allows like facilities managers, property managers, multifamily owners to plan their capex to one, extend the life of their asphalt, but then also plan for when it needs to be replaced. And so, you know, the one of the things about asphalt that people don't understand is that if you maintain the asphalt, you can increase the useful life of the asphalt by years. And so, you know, if that pothole is caused by a crack that then deteriorated more and got bigger, and then now you have a pothole that requires you to take out a big section of the parking lot and fix it, that could be prevented with regular seal coating, and crack filling and those types of
And
things.
what's the cost difference on those items?
Oh, it's like 6 times less. Yeah, it's 6 times, yeah, easily 6 times less to do it. And when you look at, I mean, it all depends on the size of your your parking lot, but I mean, you're looking at probably under, for a normal sized parking lot, to do all of the preventative maintenance, you're probably looking under $20,000, right? Every couple years. Whereas if you have to mill and pave, like mill off your parking lot and repave it because it's been so deteriorated, I mean, like our average, I mean, it depends on the size of the parking lot and some other factors, but I mean, you're going to be $100,000, $150,000 to do it. And so it's really when we can give our customers heads up and insight into where their asphalt currently is, what they need to be planning for. So our process is we go out and we do a free inspection on all of the asphalt. And then we build that maintenance plan with the customer. And it's really a win-win situation for us because we get to anticipate, when we put in the work up front, we get to anticipate that if we continue to earn their business, that they're going to work with us to do their maintenance. And so we're able to, on our side, get reoccurring revenue and a very sticky customer base. And then on their side, it gives them what they know is like, we're their contractor. We will be there when they need us. When they need an emergency repair, we will be there. We will show up. And then the second thing is it allows them to budget for it. Cause I think that asphalt is one of those things that can often be overlooked. But when you're looking at elevating the value of, like, let's say a multifamily apartment, getting your asphalt looking really good with the line stripes all perfect, it can make the whole building look newer. And it's people's first impression of you when they're going into your place of business is the parking lot. It's the first thing they see. And so these maintenance plans really help, I think, customers plan for expenses, and then also gives them the ability to put their best foot forward with their customers.
Totally. Totally. Yeah. I mean, it also just helps too on the, like the recurring side is so big when looking at projections internally, right? Of knowing you have business, knowing it's even across the year as well. We got a good question in the chat here too. Can you give some specific examples of processes you identified, SOPs that were modified, how they are modified for getting ready to go grow?
Yeah, that's great. I'll give you a couple of specific examples. Um, our ERP system that we were using did not do a very good job of directly allocating job specific costs. So understanding who was on the job, what the employee, like how much it was costing us for them to be on the job. And so we identified that as a major risk because we want to make sure we're maintaining the same profit margin, gross profit margin when we grow. And so we had to do a full scale ERP implementation that could solve some of those problems that we had identified, where when you're doing 5 jobs a day, 7 jobs a day, it's like, it's 30 jobs a week. It's a lot to go back and go through it. But at the end of the day, it's doable for a couple people to go and do. But when you start jumping to 50 jobs a day or 25 jobs a day, it's just not going to work. And so we need to use technology to bring that in. So that was an example of one of the processes that we realized, like, hey, we do not have the capabilities to do this with where we are right now. And if we really want to go to the next level, we have to fix this. And, it was a 3-month process of, identifying, researching, and then it took about a month, maybe a little less than that, to fully implement it.
And what about on like more of the go to market side of the house too, right? I'm kind of looking at, maybe growing by opening up a new market as relates to the go to market there versus saying buying a business in that space too, right? Because I think that it's a unique trade off in terms of looking at, obviously the whole goal internally is we want to grow and grow the right way. And there's different ways you can grow, right? You can grow by acquisition, you can grow by organically putting teams in certain places. Like, how do you think about kind of balancing those two things, potentially markets that you may want to be in?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. There's pros and cons to growing through acquisition and growing organically. Growing through acquisition is usually a little bit faster. So if you're trying to get from point A to point B faster, growing through acquisition is a great way to do it. Now, the downside of growing through acquisition is now you have all of these problems that you don't have in your business because they're unique to that business. And you have to deal with managing that business and all of these employees and these people that don't know you, that you didn't get to hire. You just kind of inherited everything in a way. And so that can create a lot of problems in terms of people adopting to our way of doing things. Because we do the way things, we do our work the way that we do it because we think it's the best way to do it that way. And now you're going to have conflicting cultures where these people might think their way of doing it is the best way. And so you have to kind of bridge that gap of being able to say, hey, our guiding North Star, our number one principle is that we want to do, what's best for our customer and that's going to be the most profitable for us. So, if their way is better, how do we take from that and integrate that into what we're doing? And if our way is better, how do we get them bought into our vision? But all of that takes time, and you're dealing with relationships and people, and it's a lot of change, and people don't tend to like change. And so, that's on the growth by acquisition side. I mean, you can get a lot of problems through growth by acquisition, but you can also go a little bit faster. And some of the employees that are a part of that company, like, they would never leave that company, and so you would never get access to that great talent unless you bought the company. So there's that aspect. Growing organically is usually like less linear in the sense that I know if I'm going to go buy this company, they've got $4 million of EBITDA or whatever the number is. I'm going to buy them, and then that EBITDA is going to be added into what I'm doing over here. So it's more mechanical. Whereas when you're organically growing, you may have to try a bunch of different ways. And a great example of this is we recently expanded into the Phoenix market, and our same growth strategies that we use in 30 states don't seem to be as effective. They still work, and we were still getting some business, but we noticed that it wasn't as effective as what it is in other areas. And so that created a kind of a learning curve for us of like, well, how do we be really competitive in this market? And we figured it out. It took us a couple months, but we did figure it out. And so it's not always so like rinse and repeat where it's like, oh, what we're doing here in the Southeast is definitely going to work in the Southwest. It might not. And so when you're growing organically, there's just a lot more of that kind of trial and error. And it's really important that you figure that out, because if you send millions of dollars of equipment and people and all this stuff over to that part of the country, and then they don't have, you know, that, you have to get them work or you're going to start losing money. And so, there's just kind of different nuances to either one. But we found that generally the best way to do it is to find a specialty service that we're really, really good at and focus on starting there and then combining that organic growth with buying a company. So, for example, we're really excited about our next acquisition because they have a service line of business that's about 20% of their revenue, that we feel like we could really come in and help grow that with the resources that we have, because we do a lot of that more service oriented work. And so we're looking at, well, how do we take that service line of business and double it? And then how do we take, just the general business and maybe grow it by 25%? And so that's we like the dual strategy, but I tell Sam this all the time. Like it's almost like running two different companies. Like when you're buying a company, it's like you have a whole company that's focused on buying companies, and it's totally different than if you're growing and growing organically. They're just different. And it's really just looking at the resources you want to what resources it takes to get to where you want to go, and just tools in the tool belt.
It's interesting too now because of how we're set up, right? We can go look for really specific things in companies that we want to go break into, right? Whether it be given geographies or given service lines. And what we're really seeing now too is that by bringing certain skill sets we have, or certain skill sets the companies have, or service lines they have too, you can really start compounding the value across the board when looking at the people going together and looking at the work you can go pass between them, right? It's been hugely helpful for us to go bring in, folks like that too, who can go help us grow certain divisions of it.
100%.
And when you think about, I know we're kind of talking this the other day too, on the whole IT side of this, right? I feel like people look at this space and they say, the systems may be outdated in certain ways. Like, what are things in the tech side that you've done recently to go make this feel more unison across the board?
Yeah, so we just got everybody on the same email domain, which was huge. Like that was like, you'd be so surprised at how much work that is to get everybody transitioned over and on it. But everybody having the same email domain, everybody having access to the same SharePoints and repositories of information, not having things so spread out. Those are all things. Having when somebody can't log in to our ERP system, right? Like what was the typical process before we implemented an IT department? Well, they would reach out to their supervisor. Their supervisor doesn't know how to do it because they can barely log into it themselves. So then their supervisor reaches out to somebody in more of the operations team, called the director of operations or whatever. They don't know how to do it because they don't have access to that system. So then it goes to the VP of operations, who has access to that system, who has a million other things going on, and is now having to figure out how to get this guy access. I can't tell you the number of meetings we've been in where somebody's phone starts blowing up. It's like, oh, they can't clock into the job site because they don't know how to reset their password and they can't figure it out. And so you have somebody in operations who doesn't have a technology background figuring out and walking through these guys on how to reset, their thing. And it's not efficient. And so what our IT department has really been able to stand up that has really helped just take time away, like really just increase efficiency within operations, has just been, hey, like, here's how you reset your password. I can do it for you right now. I can walk you through how to do it. I can, if you're on your computer, I can screen share with you and even do it for you if you need to, and all of those things. And really, when you look at our industry, it's like we're not the most technologically advanced workforce, right? Just in terms of paving in general. It's like, it's just, a lot of these companies that we go into, like a lot of them are pen and paper still. There was a story where we were buying our company in Texas, and I asked the chief estimator, I was like, what software are you using to estimate, your jobs and to bid them out? And he's like, oh, I'm using the yellow Notepad. And I thought that was a software. So I've never heard of that one before. So I'm Googling yellow Notepad. And yeah, it turns out he meant just like a yellow Notepad, and that he was just pen and paper, just boom, knocking out this bid. And so, looking at all the different, looking at where we're starting, like, okay, this person is using pen and paper to do all their work. We're getting time cards with coffee stains on them because it's all paper, to teaching these guys how to log into a system and how to navigate that system and how to, work within that system. I mean, it's not just I think this is where a lot of people fail, like, especially when you're looking at, people who come in and acquire a company and not really understanding where your employees are in terms of their technology use. And looking at, different logins, for example, like if you look at how easy it is to log into Twitter and Instagram and X and all of those things, you look at an ERP and it's not that simple. But when you look at the population that you have within your company of kind of, who the employees are and what their technological proficiency is, you realize you have to make it really simple if you're going to get adoption. And that's one of the key things that we do when we vet an ERP or whatever system somebody's going to be using, is like, is it easy to log into? You wouldn't think that that's a big deal, because it's probably not a big deal in most industries, but in our industry, we really have to understand and make sure that we're providing resources that our employees know how to use, can be trained on how to use, and that we put in the time to train them on, hey, here's what happens when you can't remember your password.
Totally. And I think too, I mean, you go back to like looking at the bidding side of the house. I know we made some changes recently around how we can go bid a job with much more accuracy around pricing. And that's a huge, huge, huge thing too, is that once you submit your bid, the bid gets accepted, you own that work in terms of that cost around it. So making sure your bids are actually accurate, right, in terms of costing is so crucial. So we want to kind of talk through a couple of the changes we made there as well, in terms of how we can just become far more accurate when looking at how it is we go out and bid jobs.
I think with everything, it starts with, how do you use technology to make you more efficient? And what we realized, where a lot of these companies that we've purchased and stuff, the bidding is kind of like founder magic, where it's like the founders or people who have been with the company for 25 years, they just inherently understand where they need to be at to make the job profitable. If you were to ask them, what profit margin are you going to have on this job? They'd say, oh, I bet you it's about 30%. And you know what? Most of the times they're pretty accurate. They're within a couple points of what they tell you. But then when you ask them, well, how did you get to that number? It creates this kind of question mark for them. They're like, well, I've just seen 20,000 jobs over my career, and I just know about where this one's going to land, and where it's going to be. And that's great, but you can't build a company on that. And so what we call this is unconsciously competent. So it's where somebody can just do a task and they can do it really competently, but they don't really know why they're doing it that way or how they're doing it. They can't teach somebody else how to do it the way that they do it. And so what we did first is we started looking at all of our estimating processes, saying, okay, why did you bid this the way that you bid it? Like, let's get some data, let's get some information. And we put all of that into a spreadsheet. And then when we got this new software that helps, better understand our costs, and if we know our costs, then we know what we need to bid, we were able to pull in all of kind of that dormant knowledge of people who've been doing it, and then layer that in into the process with this new software. And so now we can take somebody who doesn't have 25 years experience, they can submit a proposal and a bid. And not only is it automated and it's really fast, it's also consistent. And what it allows us to do is we can go in and change those inputs over time. And so what we're doing is we're monitoring the budget versus actuals on jobs. And if we're chronically underbidding a job in a certain area, then we'll change that input up and kind of offset, so that we can make sure that we're profitable across the board.
Well, super helpful. Before we wrap up here for day two, if you have questions in the audience, feel free to throw some in the chat as well. Take a few questions, then we will hop off here. So we'll give it a second. If you have questions, feel free to submit them. Cool. We'll give people another sec, and then we'll hop off day two. And if you're listening in, if you have topics you want us to go cover, we are always open-minded too in terms of what types of sessions we do and who we bring on here as well. So again, thanks for hopping on, but we will call this a wrap for the day two, and we will see you next week. Thanks, Chris.